Oh, it could be a big offseason for the Brooklyn Nets. And coming up on the podcast, while naming for some of the biggest and brightest stars around the league could be out of reach for the Brooklyn Nets, it doesn't mean that they can't benefit from big player movement over the next coming months. We break down some of the fringe players, expectations, and reasonable targets that the Nets can acquire should things fall their way. Right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Oh, yes, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. Dougie. It's summertime, my friend. We're about to dive in on a great conversation with the Brooklyn Nets and some of the things I think they can accomplish this offseason, assuming some big names actually are on the move.
Yeah, this is always a hard thing because some of the players that we're going to talk about for this are guys that every team kind of wants. Like, this becomes one of the secrets, the funny little secrets about free agency, especially in the NBA, is that none of these guys, at least at the top of the heap, are secrets to any other team. Like, there's a reason you hear a lot of the same names recycled, a lot of the same names, a lot of same teams want all the same guys, is because, you know, to some degree, there's a caliber of player in the NBA who is very difficult to get. They don't always command a lot of money but they command a lot of attention, right? Because, like, there's going to be worlds where the teams just simply can't, pay max or a lot for a certain kind of guy, but they all want a certain kind of guy. And so it just makes free agency and off seasons really, really interesting. And that's why, look, the player pool is small too, because there's only 5 guys that can play at a time. So it's smaller than most sports anyway. But there is a reason why on a free agent level, we do end up seeing a lot of the same names sort of bandied about. And then that's why there's surprises every year for different teams too, because those weren't the guys that were talked about and they end up coming and stepping up. So, like, that, it's like a wash, rinse, repeat, but it's also what makes the NBA a lot of fun with this, because there can be surprises every year when it comes to different guys that land on different squads.
Yeah, especially if we're talking about, we're going to talk a little bit about Zach Lavine here. We're going to mention a couple, I think, of untouchable names that aren't going anywhere, like OG Anunoby from the Toronto Raptors, Colin Sexton, etc. But when the other 4 teams that were maybe vying for Zach Lavine don't get him, they have to pivot to something new. And that's when some, I think, these either second tier or guys that you don't expect to necessarily see moved, because the package is a little fatter going from one way to the other in order to get those deals done. The interesting thing to me was, I want to get to Zach Lavine in a second, but I'm throwing this out there as what would you give for OG Anunoby, because I'm curious, just from a basketball standpoint, what you would be willing to give up to get a player like that. But I start there because I think you and I have talked about this a lot from what are the Brooklyn Nets going to do? How many players? Are they trading everybody? Are they trading nobody? How are they managing to get another $40 million under the cap? Setting expectations is important for the Nets and for every team around the NBA. And I had spoken with Sean Woodley, host of the Locked On Raptors podcast, just through messages back and forth, kind of getting a sense of where's Toronto looking to go. And he said nowhere. Like, they're standing pat. They have everyone under contract. They don't have any real issues. Would they like to make some moves in the margins? Maybe. But more than likely, they're bringing it right back. They feel really good about it because they have all of these types of players that fit the modern NBA. That is contradicted by other teams and other fan bases that are like, hey, Philadelphia in the market for OG. Couple, some playoff caliber teams looking to add OG in a potential trade. How nonsensical does it feel when everybody except for the team holding the player is interested in a trade?
Well, it's a compliment to the player because it means that everyone's sort of, and this is what I mean about, like, the dream of the offseason, right? Every fan base goes into the offseason starting to dream about sort of their perfect team. Some teams have done better about putting together these guys on the table on their own squad. We know that Toronto's always sort of drafted for length and athleticism, and then hope that the other skills have come around. We've seen that with Siakam. They did that with Scotty Barnes. Van Vliet not as much, but, like, he kind of became a player that well outstripped what the expectation was him at draft time. believe was he like the first guy? I think he may have been the first guy on a max to go undrafted or second round. It was something like that. And so with OG, it makes sense that other teams would all be vying to wanting to get him because he's super long. He's great at defense. He can knock down the three. He's been able to sort of like score on his own. His on-off numbers are great in terms of like, the team's just better with him on the court than he is with off. It would take, but why? Yeah, like I echo Sean on that one because like, why would Toronto move on from this guy? Like, this is just the kind of guy that you want. I will say the one problem, and I kind of mentioned this at the top, the one problem you run into these guys is there becomes a time when these guys end up kind of like becoming overpaid, right? Like right now, OG's contract is fine. 17, 18, $19 million a year over the next 3 to 4 years. Okay, that's great. The problem that always happens with this is that, and we're going to talk about with some of these other guys too, is that it's all good till you just pay them too much. Right. And that's the story of all, the story of all these guys is that it's all nice to have. But what you don't want to do is be the team that commits like an extra $5 million past what the actual real world value is for a guy. And now you actually have a real problem because he can't be your best player. He probably is never going to be your second best player. You probably want him in like that third to fourth best player range, except that he's going to be good enough to command money that's well beyond that. And so then you end up getting in a super sticky situation. This is always the problem. Every team runs into this problem at some point along your timeline. You end up overpaying a guy. You kind of need them, right? Because like there's a reason they're getting paid, but they become a little too overpaid, and now you can't do other moves, and now you're kind of screwed. So like OG's not there right now, but this is why he's a valuable asset.
And this is what makes it interesting around him. He has a player option in that final year for that little north of 19 million, which you assume he may opt out of depending on how these next couple of seasons go for him. And certainly would be a scenario where maybe Toronto benefits from him opting out and not getting caught in that spot of overpaying him. They've done a really good job drafting and bringing in talent in behind him. I think too. So that was the reason why I put it up there as what would you give for OG?
Which I realized I never answered that.
No, that's fine. No, but that's kind of that's the back end of this thing is one, the expectations around what's possible, what's feasible. If anything, I could see next off season, or depending on how things go for the Toronto Raptors, maybe the discussions come up around the trade deadline if you're projecting forward for Toronto and a possible move being able to get made. But if today, right now, I'll say it from the Brooklyn Nets perspective, I'm sure there's a lot of teams you would throw in there, but how much would you be willing to give up to get OG on this? You have 2-year window, then the player option, you would be paying him bigger money. Like, let's just say the Brooklyn Nets, though, would you throw the Joe Harris contract and money and picks at Toronto to get him? It's almost, for the Brooklyn Nets, it almost feels like, like the exact thing that we sort of need and want on our roster.
Yeah. It's like, right. Well, this is the other terrible situation the Nets are in, is that like all the things they have to ship out are these also the exact things that they end up needing. Also, this is, look, it's not, these trades are never supposed to be easy, right? And they're never easy around where you are on certain timelines too, because to get to this part of the timeline, you probably had to give up a bunch of assets, right? Which the Nets did. They gave up a bunch in the Harden trade. They gave up young players. And remind me to say something about Karis LeVert later too, by the way. Sure. But I don't want to do it right this second. No, if we have time with that in terms of assets, but you've already given up a ton to get where you are usually, right? And then it's like, what's left? It's like, well, what's left is stuff we kind of need, or like we don't have that. The cupboard's kind of bare. So it would take Harris' contract for sure with just the money. You'd have to probably throw something else on top of it. You probably have to give the last two. I think like something like at least one of the last Philly picks, maybe both of them, because they're going to be lower picks. And like, because OG is just like a proven commodity at this point. So it's just like not going to be an easy get. And just to reiterate what I said before about like his contract is manageable now. It's like, you just maybe don't want to, unless the skill set really improves over the next couple of years, you probably don't want to be around for the next contract. Like that's when it's going to get, like, that's when it gets a little bit dicey unless he adds an element to his game. But it would take, I just think it would probably take more than the Nets actually have, especially among an in-conference team that probably sees themselves as wanting to compete with you over the next couple of years also. Like, I don't know what would motivate them to do it. But again, I'm going to say, I understand why everyone brings these guys up, because these are exciting players that everyone wants to imagine on their team. And OG Anunoby's just don't like fall to you in the draft all the time, unless you're Toronto and you're just good at drafting them. So like, I totally get like the conversation. It just becomes really sticky.
And that's why a team that was mentioned like in these rumors of who would be vying for him is a team like Portland, who looks at themselves and says, well, maybe we'd like to keep Dame Lillard around and we want to bring in a young talent that can help take some of the pressure off of him. And in the big picture, we can probably live with having a bigger, healthier long-term contract, because if this doesn't work out, we'd like to have some younger talent on our roster if Dame Lillard ultimately is going to move. So I think it's so circumstantially based. And in all these discussions, you may find that the Brooklyn Nets are usually on the outside looking in terms of what they have to offer over other teams that could be in the market. I want to get into the Cleveland Cavaliers, Colin Sexton. We can touch on Karis LeVert as well there, and what his potential movement could mean for the Brooklyn Nets, not from a targeting him standpoint, but some of, we'll call them table scraps, but this is, I think, more realistically where the Brooklyn Nets can stand to benefit. We'll dive into that in just a second here after I tell everybody about our friends over at Built Bar. You may notice if you're watching me on YouTube, I'm a little bit red in the face. It's not because I'm out of breath, friends. I could talk for days. It's because I spent about 4 seconds in the sunshine working on my bike to go out for some rides. And the first thing I grabbed when I started cruising the streets was a Built Bar granola bar. It's, of course, the new member of the family to go along with the delicious Built protein bars. You also have the puffs as well. You know they're going to be covered in 100% chocolate, just like every single bar from Built Bar. And 3 delicious flavors are available: chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and white chocolate berry. You can go ahead and get yourself a mix box over on built.com so you can try all 3 right now. And with just 150 calories, 15 grams of protein, and only 4 grams of sugar, Built granola bars will change your world. But you have, of course, need to know that, has the code been cracked? It has. That's what Built Bar does with all their delicious products. So you go over there, you're going to want to get yourself 15% off. Why not use LOCKED15 promo code on built.com for 15% off on your order? Use that promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off over at built.com. So then I think, Doug, we're going to dive into Colin Sexton and what this means here, because circumstances, I think, in Cleveland have dictated that he is a quality player. He's proven that for himself. And also, their roster looks different now, and it makes him someone that potentially they could stand to benefit, having younger teams that are trying to get to pair a off-ball guard with their current point guard. And there's a few teams I want to get to here, but that really opens up the door. Before we touch on him, though, follow up with your point about Karis LeVert and what I think is going to be the over-evaluation of talent.
Yeah, so it's funny because like when people have been retroactively grading the Harden trade, there's they obviously throw Jared Allen in terms of like, oh, we lost a big asset in Jared Allen. He ends up go make an all-star team. He looks excellent. He's kind of just like the switchable big the Nets could use. Blah blah blah. I get it. Mm-hmm. Would you like to have him back? Sure. Like as I'll always say, you're never going to get James Harden by giving up nothing. So I never know what people expected to happen. I know that's been bandied about that he just got thrown in. I don't totally believe that's the case. But can we do a little stop about where we lost like this huge thing in Karis LeVert? He was a really nice player, and it was nice to have him on the team. And we always have the bubble performance where he would look like, if you give him the ball for, if he's allowed to dribble the air out of the ball every single possession, like, and he's going to put up big numbers. And he was great. Don't get me wrong. Like, he was really, really awesome.
We'll always have the bubble.
Yeah, but like, can we get over the part where like this is some huge piece that the Nets gave up? Like, that's just has not really borne itself all out into like any reality. Yeah. He's like a nice player. Cleveland had a negative net rating when he was on the court this year. So like, it wasn't like he was crushing those minutes. Maybe he wasn't a great pairing next to Garland. And that's just like, that wasn't like the perfect pairing. But I do think, at least from a Nets fan perspective, it's time to move on from the, like, we lost this blue chip cornerstone piece with Karis LeVert in the Harden trade. Like, that was amazing to give him. Like, they sold so high on him at that point that he could become part of that trade, that, like, in retrospect, it's even more glaring about how good of a trade from that point, like that perspective, was. They were able to put those two players together because my point is they lost nothing by losing Karis LeVert. They lost a nice guy, a nice player. He did great for the Nets. It was super fun to watch him. I totally get it. On the trajectory that they were on, it was not going to fit with him anyway. So why not just throw him in there? So I just don't really want to hear the we lost Karis LeVert piece anymore. And I know that's not where you're going, but it hasn't fit into our other discussions so far.
No, and it's true though, because you're always going to overvalue, I think, young talent, especially on your roster, and dream on what they could be, especially for the Brooklyn Nets, where you go from being this scrappy team to then getting superstars, and you're thinking, well, what could it have been if you still had Karis LeVert with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving? And for the most part, and it's not a knock on Karis LeVert or Spencer Dinwiddie, there's an outlier like Jared Allen, but for the most part, you go, I can tell you player X that ends up being as good as that. And remember, the price point matters on these pieces, especially when you see Karis LeVert having a substantial cap hit. You have to make all this stuff work. On the Cleveland side, though, when we look at this roster and we talk about Colin Sexton, the reason why I bring it up is because I think reasonable expectations around rumors that there could be a market for him. And there were three specific teams that came up that could stand to benefit the Brooklyn Nets in maybe not in a big way from fans' perspective, but this is what matters for them. It's the Pacers, it's the Spurs, it's the Pistons, because you're talking about pairing them with Halliburton in Indiana. You're talking about DeJounte Murray, obviously there with San Antonio, and Cade Cunningham on the Detroit Pistons. And what I don't even care. I don't care about the money. I don't care what happens, restructure, any of that stuff. But if Colin Sexton, then you can look into these rosters, and there's a lot of names that jump out to you that either maybe would get brought back, but are now definitely going to go to free agency, or some lower level guys that could be potentially available for a trade exemption. You might have to throw a draft asset at them just if Detroit, Indiana, or San Antonio looks and says, we don't have a real spot for these guys. May not come until the trade deadline, but there should be opportunities. I'll throw out the least sexiest guy, which I think would be Ricky Rubio there, because he's just going to walk into free agency. And at the very least, if you make a move, you guarantee that this body becomes on the market, and there's a vet minimum deal out there maybe for that, which I think the Brooklyn Nets stand to benefit from. Before we talk about some of the sexier names, and you can throw out anybody you want, because it's really what it comes down to is there's 5 or 6, I think, targetable players for the Brooklyn Nets that won't cost them a lot of money where the Nets need to be living.
Yeah, so I'll start with Sexton. So the Sexton thing is really interesting because he was obviously super high draft pick for them, was supposed to be like looking at sort of a cornerstone piece. He gets hurt, and then they put Garland in that role, and all of a sudden Cleveland just looks amazing. And it was like, but then they kind of just, there was too much injury attrition on that team. They lose Rubio, and that looks worse. I think Sexton's probably actually one of the most interesting. He's a restricted free agent. Most interesting guys this year, because I actually just don't know how the rest of the NBA evaluates him. Like on the one hand, you could be one of those younger teams and be like, talk yourself into it. You're like, hey, he's 23. He's super young. There's a lot of pedigree. He's coming off an injury. The value's never been lower. Like, this would be a good time to pair him with one of these guys. And I'm not sure you always saw tons of stuff from him in Cleveland that would make you really believe that he has superstar stuff in him either. So it's like a really weird spot, I think, with Sexton. And I think he ends up probably just coming back to Cleveland, because I think they'll just like match whatever like offer sheet they give. Go ahead, because that's where I kind of think yeah.
Yeah, and on that point, all the general speculation is Cleveland would still like to have him back, probably in the $15 to $18 million range.
Well, they probably got super kind of, I hate to put it this way, they probably got a little lucky with his number, that like he just sat the whole year out with the injury, and that it's going to kind of crush the market at least for the year, and we'll just match it and then see what happens. Like, they have another year worth of evaluation. I hate to frame things around injury like that, because it really sucks for the player. But I'm just mostly just speaking from a dollars and cents point from the Cleveland. Like, they're like, okay, we probably bought ourselves a year. We're trying to figure it out, but it's like, because they're gonna have to play Garland too, and Garland's definitely going to get paid. Yeah. So again, he's got a team option this year, which they'll exercise and then re-sign him for sure. But like Cleveland, actually, I think there will be dominoes that fall from Cleveland. Obviously, Rubio is going to hit the open market. Like, I think there are. Cleveland does have dominoes that could affect the Nets.
Yeah, and with Colin Sexton, it seems like if it gets north of 20 million, then maybe Cleveland would say, like, we don't want to end up in a spot where we're paying someone too much money. And to me, Detroit feels like would be the forefront team to say, we're going to take a bit of a big stab here to improve. We have this young core. We want to get better with it. But beyond then, you mentioned Rubio there. When we look at just over at Detroit, the two names that jumped out to me there, you can't just look over and say, well, automatically give me your best next guard that you have. But you have Diallo, who I think's value has completely plummeted since he went from the Thunder and joined Detroit on a team option, but a player option on Corey Joseph at 5.1 million I found interesting, and one that I would say you could make a case if Colin Sexton goes there. All of a sudden, there's some door that opens up where if he goes into his player option, then maybe that opens up the door for the Brooklyn Nets to come in with a trade exemption, obviously, not have to spend a lot of assets. He's 30 years old. The Cleveland Cavaliers, they're not going to be restricted, as I lose track of what name, what team. The Detroit Pistons won't be restricted from a money standpoint, but I don't know if Corey Joseph represents high value for them in the short term. So that to me is a veteran player that maybe has some value for the Brooklyn Nets specifically in that backup role.
All right, I'll talk about him, or we can talk about him here in a second. First, going to talk about our friends over at Bet Online. Bet Online continues to be the number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. They have all the latest odds, news, and sports developments. I'm over there every single day looking at the MLB lines, baseball lines, the money lines, the run lines. It really helps inform a bunch of what we're doing on the projection side. So Bet Online is kind of a must-have source when it comes to that. They have the fights on the weekends. NFL futures, if you're into that. Bet Online is your number one continued source for all sports wagering. They have live betting as well. Head on over to betonline.net. You can learn about the trends and the action. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Okay, so before we get into these last couple of names, Zach Lavine, a big one, D'Angelo Russell, another big name out there right now. Your point on Corey Joseph, though, for Detroit.
Oh, just that he is just an interesting case because he's kind of like a point guard that doesn't need the ball in his hands a ton. He was able to hit a bunch of threes over the last couple seasons, like around 40%. He doesn't solve the Nets length issues, but he would solve a little bit of like not needing the ball in his hands a ton and can play defense. Like, not like Javon Carter, but probably what they thought Javon Carter was going to be when he was with the Nets. Someone like that. It's like, hey, take the burden off some of these other guards, play a lot of defense, hit the occasional three. I'd probably still rather have Carter, but it was just crazy.
Would you rather have Corey Joseph or Patty Mills? If you could have both of them go into their player options, the money's about equal there. Would you swap them on their player options?
No, I would take Mills still. Because I don't think Joseph closes for you in the playoffs anyway. So at that point, I just take the guy that I kind of know. But yeah, let's roll through some of these other big names. I think this is there are interesting downstream effects of like what happens with some of these guys.
Yeah, so D'Angelo Russell was the other interesting one. He's making a little bit north of 31 million. You saw kind of their roster is evolving with him on board, which maybe has advanced a little more quickly than Minnesota was anticipating. He becomes a guy that a few teams are going to target. And then the other one would be he would be trade, and the number's not so big. But Zach Lavine, who wants to test free agency here, this is where the potential for a sign and trade opportunity, if he's not going to return to Chicago, and then maybe the Nets can get involved. Spurs have been mentioned. Portland has been mentioned. There's a few teams they talk about. Nets could get involved as, hey, you got to dump a little bit of money. You want to move off contract, some trade exemptions. That becomes really intriguing for me, especially when you look at the Spurs, where you have guys like Josh Richardson, even though he's making a little bit more than the highest exemption that the Nets have at 12.1. Some other players that we mentioned them before, even non-guards like a Zach Collins.
Yeah, I mean, the Nets obviously aren't going to be in the Zach Lavine or D'Angelo Russell sweepstakes, so I don't think we have to worry there. But no, I think that there's going to be these two names. Well, Russell is a little different because that's like a regime change, and it's like unclear where they view him in terms of their growth. But Lavine, if he were to sign somewhere else, really could have some pretty kind of seismic shifts because it would instantly make the Bulls probably puke if they were not able to bring him back. It'd be just a massive loss. They would definitely get a sign and trade going to be able to bring pieces back. You'd love to be like a team that tags along like the Nets, be able to team that tags along to be able to take something from that. I don't have like any great thoughts about what ends up happening. Most times these guys just go back to their team because that team can pay them the most but it's like for him, he's like, hey, why not just go out and see what's out there? I haven't been a free agent before. He talked about that in an interview. Wanting to explore what it was going to be like, probably wanted to be wine and dined a little bit. So I think usually these kind of things work themselves out. Maybe not always, but I don't know how, the names, Josh Richardson, super interesting. For the Nets, I don't know what the names specifically would be, but this is obviously the one thing that people are going to be watching the most in terms of like who makes a real run for him and where he actually thinks he can land, because this actually would shake up the Eastern Conference a little.
Well, and that's the beautiful part about it, I think, from a Nets standpoint, is all you want in all of these discussions, and Lavine being the biggest possible piece that could move, is you want the most possible movement. Because again, that's the point of this, of having this discussion, is to say the more bodies that move around, especially at a high level, the thing that ends up happening is all of the supporting cast. Because now a team X that gets Zach Lavine thinks about how do we reshape and look different now that we have this talent, right? If the Minnesota Timberwolves move D'Angelo Russell in a regime change, we're still going to be looking and saying, now, how do we make sure that we're balanced? Do we have enough depth, et cetera? They may be in the market for a player that otherwise wouldn't be moving during this offseason. So the more movement that happens is the more the Nets can stand to benefit from it. The funny thing to me is, or take it for however you want, the interesting thing is that we're talking about the Brooklyn Nets because of where they are from a cap standpoint. We're saying like tagging on. That's usually what back end of conference teams do, right? The Thunder, the Rockets, they become salary dump spaces, or hey, you got to move that guy off the books. We'll be the third partner in the trade. The Brooklyn Nets are maybe hoping to like steal some value by being the third wheel on some of these things, which is not necessarily where you anticipate being when you're coming into the fourth season of having superstar talent.
And there's a reason we threw these guys in last, because like it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to run along with some of these things. Like they had their moments with this stuff. The Nets had their times where they were able to sneak value. The Nets were one of these teams for a little bit. They were taking bad contracts. They were taking stuff that other teams wanted to get rid of. Like they made made the organization back on stuff like that, on guys like Russell, on guys like Brolo, like not on Lopez because he was a draft pick. Sorry, Mozgov, I meant. These are the guys that they kind of rolled with to kind of reform some of their value and get them and have it go somewhere else. They're not really that team anymore. But I still love the offseason because I love these conversations, because I can't wait to see what happens.
Oh, of course. No. So, I mean, listen, all you can do is with bated breath. And I think these are at least some scenarios that the Nets can keep their eyes on. And I think that's where your mind lives. By the way, we'll get out of here. But coming up, though, we know the deadline to go ahead and push off that draft pick in the upcoming draft is the 1st of June. So we'll know in short order. We do have someone from the network that I'm sneakily hiding in the wings. Should they hold on to it, we'll take a deeper dive on the draft class. But obviously right now, this feels like the biggest piece of what they can accomplish going forward. That being the case, though, as we always like to say, you head over to YouTube where you can see my beautiful sunburned face and Doug Norrie doing our thing over there. We, of course, have the podcast going. Doug did a fantastic job breaking it all down yesterday. A really good episode, great conversation. Hopefully you're subscribing over there and having a part of that as well. We'll leave you with this little thought here as we get ourselves out the door. And that is to say, as you're wheeling and dealing and looking to make things happen, sometimes you get lost in the sauce, but you are not a drop in the ocean, but the ocean in the drop. Deepak Chopra. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.